a little prayer. God, we are so grateful and thankful for you. We are thankful for this Good Friday, which so often is, it's hard to understand because there was a lot of bad things that happened on this day, on this original Friday. But we know that the things that happened on that day led to something that was great, actually. So help us, our hearts and our minds, to stay focused on the good that is coming. Help us remember that Sunday's coming and that Sunday means that we are going to have the Bible in our lives and that there's nothing bad that's going to be able to hold us back. So we ask our hearts and minds to be open to these topics. It's also something a little challenging for us to discuss, but it's something that is a part of life and that as a church we want to bring light to it and we want to have conversations about it and understanding the past. We pray this in God's name.
Amen.
And now I introduce Annie. Yay!
Leslie first. I mean, take it away.
Okay. I thought we were doing it after.
No, that's okay. Now I will introduce Annie.
Okay. And then I'm going to introduce Annie.
We're all going to take turns.
And then they're going to vote.
Annie is with us today as a family counselor and has known a lot of us for a while. So we're excited to hear some wisdom on a
Let's hope so.
topic. Yeah.
Let's hope so.
And then we'll discuss it. So thanks for coming, Annie.
Absolutely. Grateful to be here. I'm just going to dive right in. I always feel like when I'm giving a talk, it's fair for you to understand what even makes me qualified. So again, some of you know this, some of you don't though. I've been a licensed couples and family therapist for the past 18 years. I'm a certified trauma professional. From a faith perspective, I attended Catholic school from K to 12, and I like to say I'm a recovering Catholic. So that was kind of my first deconstruction. There's a lot of obvious reasons I stepped away, largely abuse and treatment of women. I helped launch and was a leader at a Christian church for 22 years, and then again, left that church due to lack of inclusion and support for LGBTQI individuals. My husband and I both did. He served on stage a lot, and both of us had conversations about not being able to have some of those beliefs connected to our identity. And so I started this, what I would call my second deconstructing process, and largely, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the book, Do I Stay Christian? So I've been reading that book and having a lot of conversations with former staff and friends and family. So some of that has informed the conversation tonight. I'm going to start with what you would expect, numbers and myths, although it's really just one number. And I think it's sorry, I'm moving too much, aren't I? In 2022, since we're only 4 months into 2023, 40 to 50% of first marriages ended in divorce. And I specify that, and I want to point it out because you'll hear statistics all the time about 50, 60% of people end up divorced. That's not correct. And so some people's presentation includes first marriages, second marriages, third marriages. We're looking at individuals. And again, this is just for a perspective of like how many people could potentially have this experience. It's about half of the people that you will meet. The myths, my more favorite part. So in being a couples and family therapist, I would say probably 30 to 40% of my caseload are couples. And part of that is because I love working with dynamics. I love the challenge of that. There's a lot of therapists that don't love the challenge of that. And so when I worked in a larger practice, people would just get funneled my way. What I notice is, and I would say many, about half, of people don't get to choose if they stay married or get divorced. And I say this pretty consistently, it takes two people to make a relationship, but one person can decide to end it. And I sit with a lot of people where they feel frustrated and the unfairness of that. You know, I used to supervise a lot of other newer therapists, and especially when it comes to working with couples and families, people will say, you know, I feel like my job, my responsibility is to help someone save their marriage. And I'm like, I have found that people come in a variety of different places. Some come in and they're like, I'm done, and I need you to pronounce this dead. That's a great job to have. Some come in and are like, I'm done, and I'm really worried about my partner, and so I need you to take care of them as I kind of like step away. Some come and they genuinely want to change and work and grow, whether that be individually or together. So there's a whole bunch of things whole bunch of different scenarios, but I do absolutely, one of the questions I ask people when they come in is, what is your level of commitment? And almost always, going back to like half of the people don't get to choose, I have one who's like, I'll do anything to make this work. And then I have one who's like, yeah, I'm kind of here to figure this out. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes that's like, I've already decided. Or I didn't include one of the scenarios that happens is people are like, I want to check this off the list of like, I tried everything. I went to counseling 3 times and didn't share anything. I tried. I think there's this going under myths. We can't change anyone, but we have to decide what we can and can't live with. So one of the things I frequently say, I'm going to back up. So in the beginning of my career, I did a lot of working in divorce support and marriage rebuilding. And I will always remember I had somebody make a comment once, if it was as difficult to get into my marriage as it was to get out of my marriage, I would have approached this completely differently. And I'm like, premarital counseling should be pretty challenging. We should be discussing the same things on this end that I see people arguing about at this stage or walking away from at this stage. And so then when I started really doing premarital counseling, it was very interesting. I would be like, my philosophy was kind of, we're going to talk about all the things that potentially could go wrong when we're not emotionally involved, because it's a very different conversation when you're not having those emotions kind of overwhelm you. In that, I will say to people, the decision to marry or be in a committed relationship is, this is the set of problems I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. Like, there is no relationship without a set of problems. And so some people do get to the point, though, where they're like, I can't live with this set of problems. Either you need to change, or I need to change, or we need to change. And again, that's an area where we don't really have control over if that happens or doesn't happen. This is one of my favorite. When I hear this attitude or this perspective of like, well, someone who got a divorce took the easy way out, I would say all the couples I work with, at a minimum, it takes 1 to 2 years to really decide that, whether that's internally or through processing. Like, a lot of people, this process starts internally. Can I, can't I, will I, won't I, what, So that's one of the most frustrating things is, these people took the easy way out. Divorce, the decision to divorce is a process, not an event. And I talk a lot about a wedding is an event, a marriage is a process. Similarly, like, a divorce is an event and a process, but the unraveling of a relationship is a process. And I think it's very easy to get those confused too, like, what are we talking about in this moment? Okay, so where do church and state intersect? When the church says they don't or can't support a group, an experience, a situation, they're actually missing the opportunity to support a person in pain. So I think back to when I was a teenager, it doesn't matter. I was an older teenager, young adult. My parents divorced. And going back to the Catholic Church, my mom told me that she approached some people and were like, hey, I want to do this divorce support group. And the answer was, well, we don't support divorce. Again, and I come back to that and I was like, but they're asking you to support people who are hurting, people who have gone through a loss. We're not. To me, that's very similar to like, well, if we do sex education, people are going to have sex. Like, again, if we have a divorce support group, it's going to be that we're supporting or encouraging something, and that's a frustrating perspective, an opportunity that's missed. I think, too, churches who say we're not going to support a specific group experience is making almost this determination of like, who's worthy of support, care, love, community. And again, it's like, whose right is it to make that decision? Some of these things we can come back and discuss and talk about. Divorce is about loss and grief. It often involves pain of abandonment and rejection. People very frequently walk away and think, what did I do? Was I got good enough? This always happens. People always leave me. It can be connected to a thread of a lot of abandonment or rejection throughout life. Identity is a big thing that changes, and an identity change for anybody is a huge transitional, almost like small t traumatic event. So we go from a we to a me, from a us to an I. A lot of times people become a co-parent or a single parent, and again, find themselves in a situation that they hadn't envisioned for their future. So there's challenges. And again, when we're saying we're not going to support this experience, this situation, we're leaving people in loss and grief, not getting support, care, love, and community. My husband and I actually had a long conversation about this week as I was kind of sharing this presentation with him, and he presented some of this, and I think this largely is what happens in the church. The church likes to celebrate victories, and when someone's marriage doesn't work, it can be framed as it wasn't saved, it wasn't restored, God didn't step in, and I think that, again, is a disservice. It's making assumptions about God and who do we think we are. And so, again, there's this sadness that if someone is in a situation where they've lost a relationship and they're getting divorced or even they're separating, it's not a failure on God, it's not a reflection of the church, it's not even a reflection of those people, and so why are we going to again, label and say we don't support individuals because they're going through a certain experience that we may have, that we, meaning like the church, has feelings about. On the inside or the outside? So I tried to separate these questions. It was way too complicated within PowerPoint, so it's gotten beyond me. Who do churches see fit for leadership? I know there's a lot of situations where it's like if you've been divorced, you're not eligible to serve in leadership. And I like to contrast that. This is my slide of contrast with who did Jesus choose as leaders? I mean, I think that's a pretty simple difference right there. Another helpful point brought up by my husband, the church often supports single parents but not divorced individuals. I thought this was really interesting. You know, there are times where like we're going to do this Christmas drive for parents, or we're going to do something special for Mother's Day or Father's Day or whatever. So what's the difference there? Why support one group and not another? And his thought, and I agree, is that single parenting is noble, but divorce is seen as being selfish. And so again, there's a lot, in a lot of these situations, there's assumptions being made about like, well, if you're divorced, that was a selfish choice, or you didn't work hard, or there's some implication of failure, whereas single parenting is just happens, when in reality, the two often go hand in hand. I think the church sometimes wants to appear to be supportive of all groups. And so they, you know, you think about small groups, and there's single groups, and couples groups, and divorce groups. But I wonder if sometimes there's shame attached to that, like, well, you're going to go to a group of all these people who didn't do it right, or who, like there can be stigma and shame attached to that. And so I'm not saying there's a right and a wrong answer, but I do think sometimes in an attempt, it's like, well, again, box checking of like, you're in this situation and you're struggling, here's the answer. It's this one group that you can go to, where all the answers are there and all these people understand, and so. Now I'm going to get in. I saved my last slide for some thoughts about the Bible. And I say that because I think when people get into deep, heated discussions about topics like this, a lot of times that's where it lands. It comes back to the Bible and like, well, what do you have to say about this? And what do you have to say about that? And how do you explain this? And how do you explain that? And I think my takeaway at the end is going to be it all depends on what lens we're looking through. So when I think about the Bible verses that people tend to point to with regards to why divorce is this sin, it's the Matthew, Mark, Luke, where they talk about, in all of those verses, there's this theme of like, well, if you divorce, you're committing adultery. And so suddenly divorce and adultery are bound together and they become one and the same. And we all know how people really struggle to deal with anything sexual. And so it's like, well, it's just all bad. Like once those two things get bound together, because we can pull up the verses if we want to discuss it later in depth, but it's like, if you get divorced, you've now committed adultery. If you are not married, so I think the binding of those two things together makes it a really tenuous topic. Genesis, Mark, and Matthew talk about in marriage you become one flesh. And again, there's a symbolic piece to that. I also think there's a context and a historical piece. So as I'm reading through some of these verses, I'm, realizing back in the day, like part of marriage was an economical situation. So it's like you're bound together. This is your new family in terms of the land you own and the money you have. So we can't take those things out of the context that they're in matters. If we substitute one flesh for one family, it's like sometimes those family relationships change. You can take that argument that people make and contrast it with all of the verses we see about judgment and condemnation and carrying each other's burdens and loving one another. It's like and I think, again, it comes down to if you're going to make an argument for or against a certain support system within a church, which lens are you choosing? So when you look at the Bible, when you make decisions about what groups you're going to have, what people are going to serve, X, Y, Z, are you looking at the Bible through the lens of economy, through morality? Are you taking it literally, or is it relational? And I think what ties this all together is Jesus came to earth to be relational, and like that, all of his preaching came back to that's the most important thing we can do is be in relationship. And so if we were to go back and look through all of the arguments and all of the things, I feel like if we're going to be Jesus' church, living the way he did, the number one thing we can do is look relationally. And, if we go back and think about things through a relational perspective, there's an easier way to do this. We look through things relationally, like we should support every person in pain. We should support people in every experience, situation. Everyone is worthy of support, love, care, and community. People who are grieving, feeling abandoned, feeling rejected, struggling with identity, all worthy of support and love. Whether or not, okay, so we talk about, was the marriage saved or restored? Did God fail the church like this? The church should celebrate supporting, loving people unconditionally. God didn't fail, but people sure do. And can an individual be saved or restored, even if a marriage is not? So I just kind of put all that out there as a lot to chew on and a lot to think about, but I think when it comes to divorce in the church, really what gets in the way is this decision about, a big picture versus an individual person. That's what I got.